Cool. So now that you have these anecdotes, these stories that are really personal to you, we're now going to move into a bit of a collective sharing. So this is a light version of a method that we use at Kinevin called an anecdote circle, and all of our methods are open source on our wiki. So I'll share this and anything else of interest afterwards. But the instruction, which I will copy into the chat as well, so that you all have it to hand. You're going to have 15 minutes in the room together. And we're going to ask you to start by sharing your anecdotes. So you'll take it in turns to do this. I would say spend about 10 minutes on this. So maybe judge the time. Maybe you share one or two rather than all three if you've got a particularly juicy one that you want to have heard. And whilst people are sharing, we're going to ask the rest of you to do a bit of active listening. So get a piece of paper, open a note on your device. And as you're hearing the anecdotes people are sharing, write down themes that you are listening to, okay, as you're interpreting the narratives. And then once you've done that for about 10 minutes, for the final 5 minutes that you have in your breakout room, you're going to collectively generate 3 or so bullet points to collectively summarize the themes in your group's learning. And this is where I wanted to talk a little bit more kind of explicitly and practically about the way that we look at narrative and story from a Kinevin perspective. So at the Kinevin Company, for anyone who's kind of not familiar, we have lots of kind of theory from Dave Snowden, my dad, around complex adaptive systems, but we also have a whole suite of methods and tools that we use that build on principles from anthropology that I have shared before, as well as other elements. So the types of story that we are often working with in my line of work is this idea of a micro narrative. So asking people to share a story about something that has happened to them recently. So it's putting someone in a familiar context, a relational context, where we're asking them to share that which they are potentially more likely to be sharing quite naturally in their environments without being overly prompted. So we call this a micro narrative, and it's the kind of idea behind this is bringing in multiple descriptions of things and events that have happened. So it's not kind of a story in a linear sense told for a purpose with a beginning and a middle and an end. It's, the story of your day, what happened today that you want to share with a loved one, with full recognition that the story you would share with a loved one about your day at work might be profoundly different to the story that you might share with your boss about your work, right? So it's this idea that stories are very social, and we choose to share them in slightly different ways. So this is the idea that micronarratives are a descriptive observation. And I wanted to share a little bit around how we designed story prompts. Now, you can do this in a workshop setting. We have a tool that does this to enable it to happen anonymously. But I think also there's some ideas around this that can kind of go out into your day to day that you don't necessarily need to run a workshop for as well. Um, so you can see an example of how we've designed a story prompt in the image on the right of the slide that I'm sharing there. So it's imagine you're having a cup of tea or coffee with someone who works in a different role to you, but still in health. What one story would you share with them that illustrates what it's like to work here in this sector at this moment in time? So this is a story prompt that I designed to work with a client in the National Health Service, the NHS in England, who I've worked with a fair amount over the years. I do a lot of health-based research working with story. My background is social anthropology, but also medical anthropology. And we use this story to understand actually what's kind of going on in terms of well-being and stress in the context, in the culture at this moment in time. And you'll notice that the way that we ask this, we don't mention well-being, we don't mention stress. There is a kind of non-hypothesis questioning around this, where we're inviting people to kind of share what's meaningful for them at this moment in time. And this is, I'm going to borrow a quote here from Nora Bateson that I use time and time again because I just love it. And Nora has a very poetic way, I think, I feel, of making us think slightly differently about things. But she says communication is not just what's said, it's what it's possible to say, right? So the way that we ask questions really matters. And if we go in with a question that kind of has an implicit answer or the expectation of a certain answer, whether rightly or wrongly, or whether we know it or not, kind of hidden in there, there's a hypothesis behind it, then what it's possible for people to say is going to potentially be quite different. So to give a kind of another example of how I've worked with a story prompt with another client, this is in the kind of field of international development. I can share a publication on this afterwards if anyone's interested. But we did some work with the Women's Refugee Commission and Plan International to explore, or the broader kind of objective of the project was to explore drivers of child and early forced marriage. So we went through a few iterations around how we could open up with a story prompt to get people to talk about this because it's a difficult thing to talk about. And eventually we decided on an option that didn't mention marriage at all because we wanted to get a kind of broader sense of what was coming up for people. So we asked the question, tell a story from the last few months that helps to illustrate to an outsider what it's like for young people to grow up in our community. So it's a really, really broad question, invites people to think about what's meaningful for them. And it kind of brings in that idea with this particular prompt of the emic and the etic coming together. So, which story would you share with someone who's not familiar in the same way that you are with this place that we're living in? So, this is a kind of micro narrative, our way of working with story. We have a tool called SenseMaker that we often use to work with a story, where we might share this with hundreds or thousands of people. And we might ask people to share stories in an anonymous way, right? And again, another quote from Nora, your story changes my story. We choose to share stories with different people for different purposes and in different ways. And there's, again, coming back to some of the anthropological ideas I shared earlier on around thinking about listening as not just an extraction, but something that becomes a participatory and ongoing process. We then kind of work with ways of sharing this narrative in maybe slightly different pockets to slightly different roles in an organization in slightly different ways so that we can open up what it's possible for people to see. So this is this idea of a disintermediated narrative that we have here on the screen. So yeah, I wanted to share a little bit about micronarrative with this idea of how do we ask a question so that we can listen to what's really happening for people. And again, thinking about listening as kind of what's going on in this kind of relationship between the descriptive and the granular, and then the more abstract in terms of how we're making meaning or sense making in a kind of continual way. We would follow up this story prompt, this question for someone who's taking part in a piece of research or work that we're doing, and with questions that ask them to consider or have a deeper reflection on where their story sits between different themes or concepts or ideas. So when you were in that breakout room a moment ago and you were sharing your descriptive experiences, your anecdotes of things that you'd learned around leadership in the last year, you were also, as you were listening to the stories of others, collectively pulling out themes that you're hearing. So this is a kind of process of sense making that we work with through the tool and in our workshops, where you're gathering that relationship between the granular and the abstract from different perspectives. And there might be some similarities in what certain people have picked up, and there might be some differences too. And let's pull them all together and see what comes through in potentially interesting ways. So just an invitation here to think about maybe one of the anecdotes that you shared in your group earlier. And I don't know, hopefully you can see the text on there. It might be a little bit small. But if you had to think about your story in relation to how your organization should proceed or in terms of what might happen next, where would your story be placed on that triangle, right? Now, it might be that one of your anecdotes is in a very, very different position to another one of your anecdotes. It might be that if you were placing your story on this shape between these concepts or ideas that are more abstract at the moment where it happened, the placement might be very different to you resharing it a year later from the benefit of hindsight in terms of what you've learned and what you're taking from it, right? So we've spoken about the idea of kind of ethnocentrism or particular worldviews or assumptions coming through in the active interpretation that can come through in bias, in research and organizations and everywhere. But there's also a kind of temporocentrism in terms of the meaning we make as that shifts over time as well. A narrative can be a really interesting way of observing that in ways that are slightly more tangible. So just to give you a bit of a sense of what that can look like in terms of when we get lots and lots of stories back. we can get a real sense of kind of patterns of thinking that come through the way that people signify the meaning of their own experiences. So that idea of epistemic justice that we touched upon earlier on. And I always share this example because I just love it. We ask groups of students and teachers to share with us a little bit more their thoughts on the future of education. And what you're seeing here is two separate visualizations of how teachers and students responded to exactly the same question. How do you think students will learn? Is this going to be through application and experience, reflecting on the lesson, or experimenting with the ideas? So it's not an either or, it's a cognitive load to really deeply reflect on the relationship between these elements. And in the patterns, we can see that these two perspectives see things in really, really quite different ways, right? So we have these kind of dominant, and these are kind of clusters, I hope it's back, of stories in this heat map. We can see dominant patterns that for teachers and students are really quite different. But there's also outlier patterns there of stories that, might be from people who aren't necessarily always benefiting from the system or context that we're in. They might be seeing things slightly different. Maybe they're a little bit of a maverick. What might these stories be telling us as well? So we can look to these for clues as to how we might want to shift things, but also stories in this kind of patterning sense, the way that we work with them at Cynefin. It's about revealing a kind of sense of a disposition or language or what might be possible or what is seen to be possible on a collective scale. Yeah, so I wanted to talk a little bit about this idea of narrative patterning as it relates to listening, and particularly listening to lots of different stories and bringing in that kind of diversity of perspectives. And there's a really lovely idea from another book, which again I'll put in the chat in a moment, by Tyson Yunkaporta. So it's a new book that he's published called Right Story, Wrong Story. Tyson is just a wonderful Aboriginal academic and activist who is based in the far north Queensland. And he has this idea of diverse ignorance or partial truths. Now, Tyson is talking a lot at the moment around some of the kind of challenges of computational models in terms of mediating our stories and our ways of interacting with the world. And, they do a lot to maybe cut out noise of all the information that we have in front of us and make sense of it. But there's a politics and a bias to how that's done. And Tyson, with this idea of diverse ignorance, kind of touches upon the danger of a single story, whether that be a small or a large one. And he talks about multiple perspectives being really kind of the best computational method that we have. So lots of brains sharing stories, and through this kind of dialogue, something emergent can come through. And for him, and to quote him, he says that ignorance is that you might have only analyzed something from one point of view, but collective analysis, that's the only way things can be done. This is why myth works. Right story is clunky and it takes time because it's supposed to take time. It happens in conversation, it happens in kinship, it happens in the way that we relate to one another in our broader social ecologies. And I wanted to give a little example around this from some of the work that I've done in health or around how narrative can give us a broader sense of patterns. So I did some work with an NHS trust a little while ago, where they wanted to look at issues around leadership, around stress, around well-being. And this was a kind of multidisciplinary team in a surgical ward. And there were, the NHS is a very, very deeply hierarchical setting. There's lots of stuff that cannot be said, so you have to be quite carefully attuned to the silence in many ways. And they wanted to understand maybe some of the more complex, systemic or processual factors that might be impacting on how people were feeling about their day-to-day environments and at work at this moment in time. So we did a story collection where we invited people from all the different roles and disciplines at play in this trust to share a story that they felt mattered and needed to be heard from their last week. So anything at all. And within the first week, we get lots and lots and lots of stories back. And this archetype narrative and character emerges of a really angry, stressed surgeon. Bullying people, harassing people, shouting at people, ricocheting off the surgical walls, generally causing a lot of mayhem and upset, especially amongst the junior members of the team. So it was causing, from the perspective of these stories, a really horrible place to work. And the people we were working with, their kind of first response to this was, okay, well, we need to go and do a behavioral intervention on these surgeons because that is awful. This should not be allowed to continue. And yes, that was one element of what the stories were showing. But when we looked deeper into it, we saw that actually all the perspective that we had gained on this so far was from those more junior members of the team. Now, this was really, really, really valuable because up until now, there hadn't really been a platform for those newer to the organization to share. Because of these very kind of deeply ingrained systems of hierarchy, there's a fear around bringing up what's coming through to you. And I think also, when you're new to an organization, quite often you think that's a you problem and not something that you might be able to have a voice in some way. So we kept the story collector open for a little bit longer. And we really tried to push this to bring in a few more perspectives so that we could get a richer description or a thicker description around what was going on. And eventually, we started to get a few stories through from surgeons themselves. And there was one or two that really kind of stood out to us, where a surgeon was talking about how the way that his day was being organized had shifted due to top-down structural changes in the organization. As a result of which, he was getting less and less human contact time with his patients. He was feeling really, really out of control. There were lots of unknowns for him, and he was noticing that the junior members of the team, he needed to rely on them more to share information with him, but that wasn't happening, and he couldn't figure out why. Right. So in this example, we understand through the patterns that are coming through these stories that stress is a really kind of distributed property of this system that's built up through people, through process, through technologies, through ways of, people relating with one another. And yes, maybe behavioral interventions are helpful in this space, but they're not the only picture. And I think what the stories did there for me is they kind of depersonalized the problem a little bit, but they also rehumanized it because stories have this really wonderful way of bridging empathy between worlds. Cool. So I'm really conscious of time now, and I really want to do the second breakout room. So I'm just going to kind of whiz on then to the idea of using stories as a way of learning, right? And we've spoken a lot about stories in a kind of more granular sense and a small sense to reveal things that might be kind of under the roots of the tree and the soil rather than that which is above. But stories are also used in a more ambiguous sense to transmute things, to share learnings in a more abstract way, right? In ways that travel through oral histories, through our fables, our myths, our legends. Um, and they often do this in fairly ambiguous ways, inviting us into a process of making sense of something on our own terms. Um, and I wanted to bring in one of my absolute favorite stories, which is Alice Through the Looking Glass for this, because much like the kind of Bateson style of communication that you and I have spoken about, Tom, I think Lewis Carroll in his books just invites this childlike curiosity that is quite aporetic, and it invites us to question things that we might be taken for granted. So this is the kind of Humpty Dumpty character in Alice Through the Looking Glass. And he's talking about words and language and meaning. So when I use a word, Humpty Dumpty said in a rather scornful tone, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. And the question is, said Alice, whether you can make words mean so many different things. The question is, says Humpty Dumpty, which is to be master. That's all. So it's a really kind of humorous way of making us think about meaning, how meaning shifts in language, that Heidegger idea of man is the language, man is the master of language, but language is the master of man. So it's that kind of symbiotic relationship between the abstract and the context. Um, but these types of stories are really wonderful and can be used in organizations to create that kind of context for communication through humor and through ambiguity. And so what I wanted to do for like 10 minutes or so is to share with you a little bit of one of our other methods around fable construction for doing that, right? Because fables are a really, really wonderful way of bringing in some of these ideas. Normally we might do this over a kind of day or two, and it would emerge very much from the kind of archetypal characters and stories particular to your organization. But I think it might be quite fun to do this and play with some of the anecdotes that you shared in your groups earlier. So a good fable focuses on an aporetic way of communicating rather than an explicit way of communicating, right? So this takes us into a space of the unknown. There's no direct answer given, and instead, they try to ask difficult questions or make us ask difficult questions. So through a fable, we might be taken into a space of relative confusion, right? And sometimes this might be a kind of offer to take this type of story and learning or feeling that we might want to see something slightly differently out into our world as a kind of meditation, if you will. But what these types of stories and fables do is to create a space for communication and learning to take place in slightly different ways, right? And this can, in some ways, disrupt our more entrained patterns of thinking or biases that come through. And when we use these in organizations as points of learning, it can make room for more contextualized meaning and actions or a sense of direction to appear. So we're going to have a little play around with this now, building on a particular type of fable from the Nasruddin fables. This is from the Sufi tradition. And Nasruddin is known as the kind of wise fool of Eastern folklore. And the image that I've added here on the slide, I think it's nice because it relates to the Cynefin framework a little bit as well. So it's this idea of looking for the key. So someone saw Nasruddin searching for something on the ground. "What have you lost, Mullah?" he asked. "My key," said the Mullah. So both went down on their knees and looked for it. After some time, the other man asked, "Where exactly did you drop your key?" To which Nasruddin responds, "Well, it's in my own house." And he says, "Well, why on earth are you looking for it here?" And Nasruddin says, "Well, there's a lot more light here under this lamp than there is in my own house." So it was a nice comical way of kind of saying that often we just look where the light shines and we're not necessarily seeing that which is not immediately obvious. So what I'm going to invite you to do now is to have a playful look at creating a fable of your own based on some of these learning anecdotes and key points that you pulled out in that last session. And you're going to have a go at creating a fable that has emerged through your collective anecdotes.
Okay, so did you want to prompt folks or ask any questions or go to the raised hand? It's up to you.
No, let's keep it open because I've done far enough talking. So let's bring this out. If anyone wants to share their fable or anything as well, please do, what the process was like. I can't see who was first with
Oh,
their.
Aaron is first. It orders people if you look
Oh,
at the full
great.
gallery.
Aaron.
Awesome. Well, first, thank you so much for just this amazing presentation. I think on my end, the it was very profound. I love narrative. I love stories, and I love the concept of active listening, clean listening, all of these things, curiosity, and uh, in application, you used a whole lot of words around subtle meaning and subtext and reading between the lines and understanding other things that are happening. And I'm on the autistic spectrum, which neurologically makes subtext difficult, if not impossible. So there's a lot in the neurodivergent world where some of the applications to your concepts, I'm like, well, how do I do this? How do I apply? I don't know. And with the narrative and the themes and some of the things happening there, I had to step back in our group because I'm like, this is too, I don't know. I'm having a hard time grabbing the subtleties that are occurring. And yeah, so I don't, I'm gonna have to chew on that for a bit because that's a big one.
Yeah.
Aaron, just a huge thank you for bringing that into this space because we hear that before. Team Neurospicy indeed, as Cara has shared in the chat with you on that. And just to share as well, like I personally I love the micro narrative because it's descriptive and it situates me, but I find that subtext quite difficult too. So you're not alone. And I think this would be a really interesting conversation to maybe take further. So if you'd like to, I'd really invite you into that. I'd love to chat with you on that. And if anyone else has anything to share on that topic too.
I would love to. Yes.
Yeah, and I would love to to do a voices session on this topic and this diversity and how
Right.
this fits in. It would be awesome if we can follow up
Yeah,
on that.
that would be very cool. Thank you so much, Aaron. Thank you. And Andre, are you next, Andres?
Yeah, I'm here. Um, I we seized the challenge of fable, and it seemed to work real well because Julie, one of our members, talked about recently passing a test, a very difficult test that few people passed the first time. So we started our fable around the test maker and how they insist, like Humpty, that their answers are correct. And if you give the incorrect answers, you don't pass. And then we extrapolated it to our own experiences. Each of us have had people who've said, this is definitely it. This is the answer, only to be found out wrong because time changes and everything else does. But I think I had the feeling during the creation of that fable that it drew us together. And then people started to add little bits and pieces to it. So I wrote down here, I now have a new future because I love doing that so much. I'm now a fabulist. And my next fable will be about John Hibbs.
You're going to be a reteller, right, David? Yeah.
Life on Guernsey.
Yeah.
Uh,
Thanks, Dave. Thanks,
Okay.
Andres.
Thank you so much. Well, one of the things that I wanted to highlight, I was joined us to the session of Erin with Eduardo, who joined later also. And I'm also trying to find the face because I'm better with the faces than with the names of the other person that brought light to something beautiful. We didn't create a fable, but we talked about the fable of this light over the cannabis metaphor. And it was beautiful to see in practice something that Erin just brought up. She was very explicit about the things that was mentioned. And we talked about why are we talking about the key and where is the key? That is the variable that we are talking about. And Erin brought something and why we don't ask the things and why someone didn't ask before, what are you looking for and why are you looking for that in here, like those specific things that are not subtextual, that are the facts, that are the key things, make this story valuable, and that are the ground of the things. So it's beautiful to see that the facts and the things that are textual are that matter, but the subtext that can be just the ground with the lights and without the lights is something that it can be even more powerful. But sometimes we need something that, what is the solid ground of the seeds? What are the questions that we need to ask? What are the things that we are looking for? And for me, that is what makes the fable stable. Because there are fables that can last for centuries or decades or millennia. And there are some that just forgettable. So for me, that is something that I was mentioned to Erin when she talked about visual arts. I come from journalism world. So I have worked with words. My father is a writer also. So I have been I have grown with words. And one of the things that I learned after many years working with media is that there are images that worth 1,000 images, that there are images that worth 1,000 words. But one of the things that I have learned is that there are words that worth 1,000 images. And those words are priceless. And sometimes you just find them and are priceless. For me, one of the words that have opened my mind to many things have been complexity. But the paradox of complexity is that when you say complexity, it just scares people. So when you say complexity, it scares people. So the beauty of complexity is that you don't talk about it. You talk about life. And that has implicitly that is complex. And for me, that has been the lesson of the past few weeks. So thank you so much for opening this and connecting these core narratives and also allowing me to connect with Erin and Eduardo. And forgive me for the other person that I forget the name, but I treasure the anecdotes, of course.
Thank you. It's nice. I love that. Mr. Hibbs, the famous center of the universe, John Hibbs.
Well, yes, it's quite embarrassing. I'm so sorry. We had a fantastic group and we had some amazing ideas. And with a tiny little bit of help from ChatGPT, I have a fable, a complete fable. And if you would like to hear it, shall I read it out?
Yes, please. I would love to.
Okay. The fox, the wind, and the chicken. In a quiet forest, a fox dreamed of building the tallest pile of stones on a hill, but every time he stacked them high, the wind knocked them down. Frustrated, the fox tried again and again, determined to make it perfect. One day, his friend, a chicken, clucked from nearby. "Why do you keep fighting the wind?" she asked. "I want my pile to stay tall," said the fox. The chicken scratched the dirt thoughtfully. "Maybe it's not the height that matters, but the courage to keep building even if it falls." The fox considered this and decided to focus on enjoying the process as he built without worrying about the result. The wind knocked the stones into surprising and beautiful shapes. The chicken clucked in approval. "See, fox, it's not about controlling the wind, it's about having the courage to let go of what you want it to be."
Wow. You better put that into a book. We need an illustrator. We can ask AI to illustrate it for you too. It's lovely.
It's great, except I thought the fox was gonna eat the chicken at the end of the story.
That could
That's
be
just a
that could be
assumption.
We're
part
being
two.
so impertinent.
Do you know what I might do? The Google Doc I shared with you, maybe I'll make that open. And if anyone has constructed a fable with or without the help of ChatGPT, drop it in and it can be a nice shared resource.
Yeah, that
Yeah,
sounds
that would be really cool.
It was a
10
good-
minutes
it
is
was a
not a
good
long
fable.
time to write a fable. I think
I
we've
know.
done quite
Normally
well.
we do this over like 2 days, so you guys did really well.
Yeah.
I think Thanos is raising his hand or her hand. I can't your cloudy thing. I can't tell. Sorry, I apologize.
Yeah.
Thanos, hello. Nice to see you.
Hi, Ellie. Well, we didn't come up with a fable per se, but there was a really beautiful story behind that. So I thought about the fable. So there was a neighbor goes into Nasruddin's yard and he sees Nasruddin throwing away the food leftovers out of the fence. He says, "Mullah, why don't you get a domestic dog or something to feed them instead of throwing it to the jackals outside?" And Nasruddin responds, "Because the jackals only come at night and they keep the wild dogs away." So this came from Rob's story about how there was a fire in his neighborhood and there were 3 firefighters who died during that fire. And there were policemen, guarding the place. And he would bring coffee to the policemen every morning. They wouldn't let him approach, so he never saw the policeman, but he would leave the coffee on the sidewalk and they would drink it. And I don't know how many years later, 10 or 15 years later, he went to a party and then a guy comes to him and says, "I know you. You're the guy who were bringing us the coffee, and it's the only beautiful thing anyone has ever done for me as a policeman." So we made this fable out of, showing gratitude to someone that did something for you without you even knowing him, without him even knowing you.
Great. I love it.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you, Thanos, for sharing.
And Mr. Vishva, who's been it's been his first time Zoom meistering today. So great job, Vishva. So
Thank you, Vishwa.
On the topic of the fable and neurodivergence, so the structure of the story is what was coming up to me at the end of it, of how do we structure the story and how do you deliver the message? Rather than what is the message, how do you structure it so that it stays with the person,
That's
is
right.
becoming relevant? And so, what and how? Obviously, why, but what and how?
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, Ellie, any wisdom there, or Andres? How do you structure the story so that it?
I
Yeah.
mean, when we do that method in full, we have a structure which is kind of a non-linear way of piecing together your fable, but it comes, as I say, from anecdotes that you've collected in that space or previously. But it's making me think, and I'm sorry, there is another book that I'm going to bring in here. There's different ways of creating narrative structures. So the one that we're quite familiar with, for example, is the kind of hero's journey, right? Where the meaning is in a certain place in that shape of how the story takes shape and place. But there's another book by Mary Douglas that I want to drop in. I think it's called Thinking in Circles. And she talks about a different way of structuring narrative that would have been at play when the Old Testament was spoken and then written. And she talks about, and it's like this kind of idea of temporocentrism as well, and that the structure and the meaning. So if we're reading something with a different structure in mind, the meaning is slightly different, or it changes or is warped in some way. But I think there's lots and lots of different ways of structuring a narrative, depending on what narrative you're trying to generate. And I've got another reference around different ways of doing that, but I can't remember it. So I'll try and pull it out and
But
share it with them afterwards.
just to add one thing, when I go through yoga, I basically deconstruct all narratives by not attaching anything to anything that arises. And then I have the flexibility of making any narrative I want and unmaking it whenever I want it. Having the base tools to create narratives flexibly rather than imposing a limitation on myself.
And I love that. And I think, we've spoken a lot about a kind of wordy narrative. Whereas if you think about things in a kind of somatic space or like somatic experiencing or something like that, quite often it's this idea of actually, like you're saying, decoupling a narrative or a story from that which is a sensation. So yeah, thank you so much for bringing that in, Vishwa. There's lots of different ways to think about this.
Okay, we are at the top of the hour. Ellie has agreed to stay on a little bit longer, so those who can join. Basir, did you still have a question? You had your hand up a moment ago.
Yeah, I'll just make it very quick. I will put in the link for the cauldron that Nasruddin Hoja borrows. I won't spoil the story, but it is something immortal because it carries the patterns of the Ponzi scheme, greed, but also common sense. So I will put in the link. The system didn't allow me to copy paste the entire thing. Thank you.
And I hope everyone knows that you can share the chat. I mean, save the chat for yourself if you at the top of the chat window, there's in the little three dots, there's a save chat, and you'll get all those references. So if Ellie, you can get your last books in there, we'll all be able to save them and have a copy. And I'll try to get them posted in the community space as well.
Just saying thank you for this amazing evening. It was a pleasure to be here. My first time, and hopefully will come to the community. Thanks for the invitation. Bravo, Ellie.
Thank you for joining.
Thank you so much.
Okay, it looks like we're good. Thank you, Ellie, so much. Thank you, everyone, for coming. This is a continuing journey that really is very meaningful to us, and we think is part of creating a better world. So, thank you.